Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing compound interest and APR/interest rates. To begin, let's discuss APR, or annual percentage rate. This number is effectively a monitor of the total interest you're going to be paying back on a loan over the course of a year. Now, if you're wondering how APR differs from a normal interest rate, typically a normal interest rate only factors in the interest that goes against the principal or the initial amount you borrowed, whereas APR also factors in closing costs, any fees. It doesn't necessarily include 100% of everything, but it's more inclusive and gives you a better overall understanding of how much that loan is going to cost relative to how much you took out initially. So for example, if I get a loan for $1,000 and the interest rate is 2%, but then there's a bunch of fees and closing costs and stuff associated with that, the APR might be actually 2.5 or 3% depending on how much those fees are. And as a result of that, I'll have to pay more per month and more at the end of the year to cover that loan, even though the interest rate seems lower than what the APR is. That said, APR is almost always used in the terms of when you're getting a loan. And it's an especially strong tool when you're trying to compare two loans together. Let's say you have two different providers. They'll say, oh, this one is 2% interest rate and this one's 2.5, but that's maybe not an A to B comparison if they have different fees or other different things involved that are getting tacked onto that loan. So always try to compare the APRs together. That'll give you a direct apples to apples comparison, and it'll tell you which one will be cheaper long term. So there's a number of different videos that probably show in a lot more depth how you calculate APR and how that affects your payments, but the general gist of it is you take whatever the APR is, that's the percentage that you're going to pay over the course of a year, and you divide it by however many payment terms there are. So let's give an example where we have a loan of $1,000. If your APR is 5%, that means your total is going to be $50 over the year that you're going to pay in interest. And that's just 5% of the $1,000, or 0.05 times 1,000. That's how you get to that number. And then how that works into your periodic payments is you divide that total annual cost into your periodic payments. So for example, if you're paying once a month, that's 12 payments, you would divide the 50 by 12, and that would give you $4.17 roughly per month that you would pay in the interest. Even though you're paying off the loan incrementally, they're not going to calculate a different interest rate every single month. This is really meant to simplify it, so that way you say, okay, you're starting with a balance of 1,000. We're just going to say this is what the interest should be at the end of the year, divide that each month, rather than saying you get more interest up front and then it kind of decays off of that. That just makes it a lot more complex if you're calculating the interest based on the actual balance every single month or every single payment. Things get really hairy really quickly. APR kind of simplifies that by dividing the total expected interest by your total expected number of payments instead, to make it a consistent amount throughout the year. Now, on the other hand, let's say you have a payment that's like weekly instead, and or a loan that's compounded weekly. So going back to our initial example of $1,000, if you have a 5% interest rate and $50 a year in interest you're paying, if you break that down to a weekly basis, it's about 96 cents per week of interest that you would pay. Again, it's about normalizing how much your total cost is over those set increments. That way you're paying a consistent amount of interest, and it's not a more complex calculation. It's more time consuming for the banks to calculate. It's harder for you to calculate. It's just a good way to simplify it. Now, why is APR important? This is actually the number one thing that I personally look at when I'm getting a loan, is the annual percentage rate. And if it doesn't already include it, what are the upfront costs of initiating a loan? Those are the more important factors for me, and the reason for that is because of compound interest. Now, compound interest in simplest terms is the interest that you earn on interest that you've earned. Compound interest is literally what it sounds like. You have a certain amount that's either a loan or in your savings account, you get interest on that amount, and then that new total, you get interest based on that full total instead of on that initial amount that you started with. Over time, it builds up more and more and more. It kind of snowballs, and it has what's called exponential growth. And that is, it kind of starts with a slow curve, and then it gets a really steep curve and hits some very big numbers relatively quick far down the line. Let's go back to our example. If you had simple interest on a savings account, that is, you have interest only on what you initially deposit, and you deposit $1,000. Let's say you get 5% interest, which is probably not a realistic amount for a savings account nowadays, but just for argument's sake, it makes a nice clean example. So that would give you $50 per year of interest that you get. And if you have simple interest instead of compounding interest, the next year after that, they're only going to give you the $50 based on your $1,000 initial investment again, and the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that, they're only going to give you $50 a year. So every year your account increases by that $50. That's a linear increase. increase. Now I can't do exponential growth in my head, so I'm going to cheat here. What I'm going to do is link this calculator in the description below. This is actually a government-sponsored website that calculates compound interest for you to show how different interest rates and how different initial payments and recurring payments or recurring contributions, that is extra money that you routinely put towards this balance, this calculator shows how that grows over time. So for example, if you have a savings account and you deposit an extra $100 per week into that account, that shows how this will compound. Or on the other hand, if you have a loan and you pay an extra $100 per week towards that loan, this will show you how much you save. So going here, let's say our initial investment is $1,000. Our monthly contribution is going to be $0. We're not going to give anything else. It's only that initial money that we put into the bank account. Length of time in years, we're going to put in 50 years just to say that this is a long-term savings. And our estimated interest rate, we're going to put in 5%. Now, interest rate variance range for this calculator, that's how much change in interest rate will affect it. So that way you have an overlay to say, okay, if it was 2% higher, it would go up here. If it was 2% lower, it would go down there. For now, we're not going to worry about that. This is just to show how compounding interest helps you over time. So if it's compounded annually, which is what we were doing before for our other calculation, it shows here on the graph, you can see this red line goes out and then it slowly starts increasing in slope, meaning you're gaining more and more money per year, even though your interest rate is the same. And the reason is the initial amount you put in there is growing the same percentage, but it's the same percentage of a larger pie to begin with. Think of it like this. You have a cake, and every single time you take a single slice of the cake, however much cake is in that slice, you're going to add on to the total amount of the cake. That's how much it grows by, and the cake's going to get a little bit bigger. The next year, you're cutting the same equal pieces, but you're starting with a larger cake. And then you're feeding it back in, and you're just gonna keep doing that. And over time, this cake's gonna grow and grow and grow. And as you can see, long term, that really compounds into a substantial amount of money, especially when you're looking at a time frame of 30 to 50 years. And what you can see is, especially as a long-term investment, that makes it a substantially higher increase than what you would get from a normal or simple interest rate that we just calculated. So for example, let's look 10 years out. With our simple interest rate, we were earning $50 a year times 10 years, it's $500 plus our initial amount that we put in there of $1,000. That would bring our total balance to $1,500 if we had simple interest. With compound interest at the same percent increase of 5% per year, we'd have $1,628.89. So if you take the difference of that $1,500 versus the $1,628.89, it's just under an extra $130 you earn over a 5-year span based on that initial $1,000 investment. And while that doesn't sound like a lot, that's an extra 12.9%. That's almost 13% more, and the only difference is that we're compounding the interest instead of having the interest only applied to that principal amount. Now this difference gets even more drastic when you look farther down the line. For a point of reference, let's check the 50-year mark and see how big of a difference it is there. 50 years times $50 per year with simple interest gives us an extra $2,500. If you add in our initial $1,000 investment, that gives you a total balance of $3,500 at the end of 50 years. Now using the same interest rate but with compounding interest at a 50-year mark with the same investment, our total balance would be $11,467.40. As a quick point of reference, that's over triple the amount of your simple interest because you're using compound interest instead. So as you can see, long term, this really snowballs. It went from a 13% difference in 5 years to like a 300% difference over 50 years. That's a pretty big impact. Now, why is this so important? The point I'm making here is compound interest can be super beneficial, especially if you're trying to invest long term and save for the future. And because of how it compounds and builds more and more and more each year, it's important to build up as much savings as you can as early as you can to give it more time to grow in a compounding manner. On the flip side of that, compounding interest can also be your worst enemy in the sense that it accrues more debt if you're taking out a loan. The same principle that helps you here with a savings account really hurts you on the other side if you take a loan out. This is especially true for any time you borrow money that has deferred payments. So for example, one that I personally experienced was student loan debt. In this case, I didn't have to give back any payments until after I had already graduated, and then me not really planning ahead at that time in my life, I didn't pay down any of the interest or the principal because I was quite frankly frankly a broke college student, so I didn't worry about it yet because I couldn't afford to worry about it. The problem is I was getting interest on top of that principal and then interest on top of that interest, so it was having that almost exponential growth early on. And fortunately, that's only 4 years, not, 50 years. But even as we showed here, it's about a 13% difference even at the 5-year mark, assuming a 5% average interest rate. Now, private student loans when I was going to school were higher than that for interest rate. So doing some basic math, it adds an extra 15 to 20% debt on top of what you already had by deferring it for those few years. On the other hand, if you look at the breakdown of what you pay early on for big loans, so for example, a mortgage, a car payment, student loan debt, stuff like that, anything that's like a higher dollar amount, most of the payments early on go to interest payments only, and very little of it goes to the principal, so your total balance doesn't go down substantially in those early months. Or in cases like a mortgage where you have a 30-year term, in those first several years, your balance is not going to go down significantly relative to what you pay per month. So going back to an easy example, let's say your mortgage payment's $1,000 a month and you have a 5% APR interest rate. That would mean your house is somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 depending on the tax rate for your area. However, if you were to break down how that $1,000 a month gets distributed to the payment, you'd find only about $200 or so, maybe $150 of it would go to your principal. Everything else of the $1,000 goes to interest rates and taxes, which is basically money that you're lighting on fire and you're never going to see again. There's no nice way to sugarcoat this. Any money that you pay in interest on anything ever is money that you're basically lighting on fire and paying to somebody else so that they can go and make more money on it. That's the reality of how banks work. So here's what this means. If you're in a position that you're able to save as much as you can as early as you can, that'll significantly help you down the line with compound interest. But on the other hand, if you have any debts, especially high dollar debts like student loans or a mortgage, the more you can pay off and the earlier you can pay it off, the more you will prevent in compound interest down the line. So this is the only reason that I'm able to afford the lifestyle I have and the things that I have, most notably among them being the Dodge Viper that I purchased, is because I very aggressively paid off my student loans as early as possible. Had I used the entire length that I was allowed to pay back my student loans, which was 10 to 15 years on some of them, on my $100,000 or so that I initially took out, I would have paid about $185,000 back in total repayment by the end, which, as you can tell, is almost twice what I initially took out. But by paying as much as I could afford to as early as I could afford to, my total repayment was closer to about $130,000 to $140,000. I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but some basic mental math tells you that saved me $50,000, give or take, in interest alone over the course of several years. So while it was definitely a burden to pay all that out of my pocket as early as I did, and while I definitely had to make financial sacrifices elsewhere to avoid that, long term it's put me in a much stronger financial position because now I'm not literally lighting this extra $50,000 on fire that I'll never get any return on, that I'll never have any equity in, and instead I'm able to put that money towards other things that I can build equity in, potentially put it towards a retirement fund, and then allow the compound interest to benefit me on the money that I save. That's why compounding interest is so important, both on your investments as well as on any debts you have. What I always recommend to people, and what I did personally, is if you have higher interest debts, make sure you pay that off before you invest the money in anything that's going to give you returns, unless the returns are guaranteed to be higher than the interest you're losing elsewhere. I'll do another video on why that is, but as a smart investment strategy, always pay off your highest interest debts first. That is going to be the best way and the easiest way to increase your long-term financial stability and to put yourself in a much stronger financial position down the road. Now that we've established how compound interest is very important and how it impacts the total balance long-term, let's look at the other side, which is the raw interest rate. The interest rate, or in this case specifically the APR, which kind of factors in the interest rate with all these other factors like the fees and costs, that's going to affect how quickly this debt or savings and investment fund grows and compounds. Coming back to our calculator here, using the same example with our 5% compounding interest rate, $1,000 initial investment over 50 years, our final balance was $11,467.40. Again, that's a 5% interest rate. Now, if we go back and we change only the interest rate and we make it 6%, that's all I'm going to do is 6%, 1% higher, and we recalculate. You can see this curve here gets a lot steeper towards the end. So our actual savings after 50 years went from $11,467.40 up to $18,420.15. Once again, this is 1% difference to the interest rate, and at the 50-year mark, it's a 61% higher increase in the total amount we'll have saved. That's substantial. That's huge. And that same concept applies to debts and loans. So if you have two loans and one is at 5% and one is at 6%, the one at 6% is going to hurt you a lot more long term. So if you're making extra payments and you have the funds available to do so to pay down the debt, always start with the higher interest ones first, because that is going to give you the most financial benefit long term. Even if it is only a few tenths of a percentage higher, or if it's a full percentage higher, always pay down the highest interest debt you have first and then work your way down from there. The one exception is like if you have a 6% loan that you have 2 payments left on until it's paid off, and you have a 5% loan that you just took out and it's got 5.5 years left. In that case, you're not accruing a whole lot of interest on the 6% loan because it's kind of lower in balance at that point. I would still pay it off in that case to eliminate it completely, to be done with that payment and to not be accruing interest. But that's one of the only situations I can think of where you might want to put money towards a lower APR loan instead of a higher APR loan. Again, I'd still do it towards the higher percentage loan there, but that's literally the only exception I could think of, so I figured I would include it just to play devil's advocate. But I think you're getting the point. Now let's look at this a slightly different way. This is kind of how I looked at it when I was paying off my student loan debts to motivate me to pay them off as soon as possible. I calculated out how much I would save long term per dollar that I spent now, and what that did is gave me an approximated adjusted value of how much I spent now versus how much that dollar would be worth in the future. And that basically is every dollar I spend now, how much does that interest compound into down the road, because that's how much it's going to save me long term. What I found was that early on, especially in the first 6 months to a year of a longer term loan, especially like a 10 to 15 year term loan, if you're somewhere in the 5 to 7% interest rate, every dollar that you spend in that first couple of months is anywhere from $1.25 to $1.40 that it's going to save you long term. And you might be saying, oh, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of difference, but again, let's do some math here. If you have $5,000 that you put down and it saves you $1.40 for every dollar that you put in, it's gonna save you an extra $2,000 long term. So yeah, you're forking out $5,000 earlier, but it's forking out $5,000 now to save another $2,000 full dollars later. Personally, looking at it like that is what motivated me to pay off as much as I can. Depending on the individual loan, I took usually anywhere from 3.5 years to about 5.5 years. And again, I had 10 to 15 years to pay off most of these, but most of them got paid off closer to the 5-year mark. Even though I still took half the time I had to pay them back, I still saved $50,000 total because of the power of compound interest. If you're wondering how I can afford a Viper, that's literally how. I saved $50,000. That's 1.5 times what I paid for the Viper. And on top of that, no longer having those recurring monthly payments of the student loans, I could afford to finance the car and make those monthly payments on it and still have it be several $100s less per month than what I was paying towards my student loans for the minimum payment amount. Paying off your debts as early as you can will free up a lot of your money long term with the savings you'll get from the interest, and it will also free up how much you have to pay every month so you can do other more fun and enjoyable things with that money. And that's my big takeaway today. Compound interest rates can really rack up a much more substantial amount of money onto the bill after a long term. And in the sense of a savings or investment account, that really helps you. In the sense of debts, that really hurts you. This is especially true for things like credit cards, which usually have 20-something% interest rates. Those are literally designed that you only pay for the interest and the balance never goes away, so they can charge you the maximum amount every month, and if you're only paying the minimum balance, that debt's never going to be cleared. So they're extremely dangerous, and that's why you have to focus on these high interest debts first. Otherwise, it's going to bury you in a financial hole so deep you'll never be able to claw your way back out. Pay attention to interest rates. Get the best interest rates you can. You want a higher interest rate on your investments, you want a lower interest rate on your loans, and pay off all of your high interest debts as early as you can now, and you'll have a much better financial situation later on. That's why interest rates are so important. That's why compounding interest is so important. So that's all I've got for this time, guys. That's my crash course on both compounding interest and interest rates, specifically APR. Hopefully you guys found this helpful, and if you want to see more videos like this in the future, please consider subscribing, and that just lets me know what kind of content to focus on. Otherwise, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.